It started on a quiet Saturday morning in a neighborhood that looked like any other: neat lawns, children's bikes left carelessly on porches, and flags fluttering in the breeze. But beneath that surface of calm, something ugly was brewing. For Marcus, a black veteran who had proudly served his country overseas, home was supposed to be a sanctuary. After years in uniform, he wanted nothing more than peace, peace to work his land, to raise his kids, to live with dignity. Yet, instead of finding rest, he found himself at war again, this time not on foreign soil but on the very ground he called home. The trouble began with a knock on the door. When Marcus opened it, he was met with two men in tactical-style uniforms, badges shining on their chests. They claimed to be HOA enforcement officers. Their tone was sharp, their presence heavy. Without invitation, they stepped closer, announcing they had come to collect firearms that Marcus allegedly kept in violation of community rules. He froze for a moment. He knew his rights. The Constitution protected him. His service protected him. But here he was, confronted on his doorstep as though he were a criminal in his own house. Something in their eyes unsettled him, too eager, too aggressive, nothing like trained law enforcement. And then it hit him. These weren't real officers. These were imposters, men acting under the false authority of a homeowners association, dressed in cheap knockoff uniforms, hoping intimidation would get them what they wanted. Marcus's heart pounded, but his mind sharpened. Years of military training surged back, reminding him how to read danger, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to act when the stakes were life or death. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was an attack on his dignity, his safety, and his freedom. Marcus stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. The two men barked orders, telling him to hand over his weapons, for the good of the neighborhood. Their voices were dripping with false authority, as if speaking louder could disguise their illegitimacy. Marcus didn't flinch. He had seen men like this before, in villages overseas, where militias pretended to be protectors while preying on the weak. He recognized the performance, the bluster. And he knew one thing for certain: men like this thrived on fear. "Show me your credentials," Marcus demanded, his voice steady. The so-called officers shifted uncomfortably. One flashed a laminated card that looked freshly printed, edges curling from cheap ink. The other avoided his gaze entirely. Marcus felt anger rising, but he kept it contained. Discipline had been drilled into him, emotions could not control the battlefield. When Marcus refused entry, the men's aggression sharpened. They stepped closer, their voices rising. Neighbors began peeking from windows, drawn to the tension brewing on his doorstep. The scene was becoming bigger than a simple confrontation. It was a test of power, of who would fold first. Marcus thought of his children sleeping upstairs, of the countless sacrifices he had made for a flag that still did not always protect men who looked like him. He knew that if he gave in now, if he allowed these impostors to rob him of his rights, the message would echo through the neighborhood, that dignity could be stripped away without resistance, that intimidation could silence truth. His military instincts guided him: establish control, neutralize the threat, and protect your ground. In one swift move, he pulled out his phone and began recording, his calm voice cutting through their false authority. "You're not police. You're not federal. And you will not enter my home." The recording was more than just evidence, it was Marcus's shield. The moment his phone camera caught their faces, the impostors hesitated. Real power doesn't fear being documented, but fraud does. Marcus's voice grew stronger, layered with the authority of a man who had once commanded soldiers. He declared that their actions were illegal, that they were impersonating officers, and that they were trespassing on private property. Neighbors began stepping outside now, murmuring among themselves, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some clutched their children close, others whispered about whether to call the police. The pressure shifted. What had begun as two men trying to corner Marcus was now a public standoff. And Marcus understood the importance of witnesses. The impostors grew restless. One tried bluffing again, saying the HOA had voted to disarm him because guns didn't belong in their community. The absurdity stung. Marcus had bled for this country, carried weapons not to terrorize but to defend. And now men who had never served, never sacrificed, dared to strip him of what little security he had left. His patience broke. He took a single step forward, his posture rigid, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. You think this uniform I wore overseas was for nothing? You think you can walk up here, dressed like cowards, and take from me what I earned with blood? No. Not today. The impostors faltered, the crowd watching them closely. Marcus knew the tide was turning. His next move would decide whether this would escalate into violence or end with their humiliation. He didn't want blood on his lawn. But he was prepared. If they forced his hand, he would unleash the protocols that had kept him alive in war zones far deadlier than this. Marcus called out loudly enough for the entire block to hear, "Real police are on the way." He had already dialed 911 while keeping his camera steady. The impostors froze, realizing their window was closing. Their bravado cracked, replaced by unease. Marcus had taken command of the battlefield without firing a shot, using discipline and strategy over rage. The minutes stretched, each second weighed with tension. Neighbors stood on porches, some recording with their phones, others shouting words of support. One elderly man, who had always waved to Marcus in the mornings, spoke up, "We know who you are. You're not cops. Get out before this goes further." His voice gave courage to others, and soon a chorus rose, rejecting the impostors' lies. Marcus held his ground, recalling the principles of protocol he had lived by as a soldier: maintain perimeter, control communication, command presence. Every action was deliberate. He positioned himself between the men and his door, making it clear that his home was off limits. His tone was calm, his words precise, his body unmoving. This was how you face down fear, not with chaos, but with clarity. When sirens finally wailed in the distance, panic swept across the impostors' faces. They stammered excuses, claiming they had authority, that the HOA would back them up. But no one believed them anymore. The crowd, once hesitant, now stood firmly with Marcus. He had turned neighbors into allies, witnesses into defenders. By the time real officers arrived, the impostors' courage had evaporated. They were taken into custody, their fake badges confiscated, their scheme exposed for the fraud it was. Justice had arrived, but it was Marcus's resolve that had carried the day. Without him, the story could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it ended with truth. As the impostors were led away, Marcus finally exhaled. The weight of the moment pressed against him, but so did a quiet pride. He hadn't just defended his home, he had defended his dignity, his rights, and the example his children would one day look back on. They would remember their father standing strong, unbroken, against men who thought intimidation could strip away his humanity. The real officers commended Marcus for his composure, though he knew too well that respect from law enforcement was not always guaranteed for men like him. But in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who had witnessed everything, Marcus felt something shift. Fear had not won. Silence had not won. Dignity had. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops, Marcus sat on his porch in quiet reflection. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, but he understood how fragile that peace could be when prejudice and arrogance masquerade as authority. He thought of the battles he had fought overseas, and how in many ways this one felt heavier. There, he had been armed with comrades, weapons, and strategy. Here, he had faced the fight alone, with only his training, his discipline, and his refusal to bow. For Marcus, the lesson was clear: you cannot let false power define your worth. You cannot let intimidation dictate your dignity. And above all, you cannot allow anyone, whether in uniform or pretending to wear one, to strip away the rights you have earned through sacrifice. His story spread through the neighborhood, then across the community, a reminder that courage is contagious. Marcus had stood against impostors, but more than that, he had stood for every man and woman who had ever been told they were less. In the end, his strength was not in the weapons they tried to take, but in the dignity they could never touch.